All right. Congratulations on the completion of Module 8. I wanted to talk to you guys this week about our Module 8 Think About It question and the use of truth serum and whether that would be ethical in this scenario. So, most of you agreed with Olson, or I should say, most of you agreed with the professionals that Olson interviewed for this week, which was that the use of truth serum would be justified simply because of the potential harm that's to come, and a lot of you shared your perspectives one way or the other, but didn't necessarily support them with ethical theory. So I just wanted to point out to all of you from this point on, if I ask you to support your position, or if I ask you to analyze something, make sure you use various ethical theories to support your position. Don't just say it's for the good of the nation, it's good for national security, because the whole point of this course is to teach you to be able to defend your position and examine things thoroughly before making a decision. So show me that you're thinking through this from a variety of ethical perspectives, and show me that you can defend them um, and defend your position by using those ethical perspectives. Do that every time, and all your assignments will be good to go. Um, this isn't a journalism class. This is ethics and applied intelligence. So, I need you to apply ethics to intelligence, not just give me your opinion. So, I want your opinion, but I want your opinion supported by the ethical concepts that we've talked about so far in the class. So, that said, most of you did agree with the professionals. I think it's important to point out that some of you pointed out in your journals that the only professionals interviewed in this instance were those who work for the intelligence community. We didn't see any perspectives of students. We also didn't see the rabbi's perspective, which we've got a lot of his take on things in our reading so far. So really we have a very narrow perspective here when we get their opinions on this case. I would personally like to see a variety of perspectives before kind of coming to my own conclusions, but in any event, if we're going to apply a variety of ethical theories to this case study, I want to start with Belleby's because to me, the just intelligence principles are the most applicable to this specific instance because this is intelligence work. We are using one of the darker arts, and it's something to me we need to examine all the principles and see if they align and see if we have justification. So, looking at discrimination, obviously, this is an individual who seeks to cause harm. They are a known terrorist. So we're going to say that this person is a legitimate target. We can say that Aziz falls within discrimination. Just cause. Looking at just cause, we're trying to stop an attack from happening, and we're trying to save lives. So we have just cause to find out or to get this information from him. Then we go to right intentions. Again, our intentions are noble. So we're trying to prevent harm, and we're trying to stop an attack. So we have the right intentions. Proportionality. Now, this one is probably the most unclear because we're not quite sure what exactly has been tried at this point and how many things we've tried to get the information from Aziz. But it's important to point out that there is a significant harm, and the harm that we are causing is not as harmful as the harm that he will be causing, and therefore we do meet proportionality. So what's a little more questionable than that is have we met last resort? What else have we done? Have we used leverage? To me, that's one of the most efficient ways of getting information is proper leverage. And yes, leverage can cause significant mental harm to an individual, especially if you're threatening to bring their family out into public or cause harm to their family. Now that's important that we never do such a thing, but we can say that we're going to do those things in order to get information, to get the information we need. So there's a difference between going to do those things in order to get the information we need, and there's a difference between actually doing them in order to get the information we need. So there's a difference. Causing actual harm and threatening to do that harm is, and following through with that are two different things. So they don't know what we're willing to do, so that's something that it's important to talk about. Is yes, we can do. We can lie to the individual. It's deception. It's manipulation. These are all things that we can justify on the ladder of escalation if there is enough justification. And in this situation, there definitely is. So I would just want to know. The only thing I would want to know is if we've tried other things before we're going to do something that we're not really quite sure is going to be useful. And that's a big thing when we talked about using truth serum. It doesn't have a great track record of being accurate or useful, as it lowers inhibition, it gets them talking. Sometimes it's effective, sometimes it's not effective. So we don't really have a high degree of certainty that this is going to work. So I want to make sure myself as the intelligence professional that we've tried other things that do tend to work better, such as leverage. Okay, then the biggest thing in this situation is authority. For this one in particular, we need to go outside of the FBI or the CIA or whoever's making the decision in this case, or decisions in this case. I don't remember who it was, but we need to go outside of it and seek judiciary authority for conducting this level and a lot of you did a great job breaking down the harms, and the biggest ones in this situation are harms to autonomy, harms to mental integrity, and harms to self-worth. These are big ones. Security and privacy, those are ones that most of us would agree we're willing to sacrifice, and that generally are sacrificed when we arrest someone for any type of potential crime. So we all would agree with those. Now the question is, what degree of harm to the others can be justified for the sake of saving lives? And so if you can all look at this in multiple ethical perspectives, you're going to have a better idea of what the right thing to do is. And while we look at it through Bellaby's just intelligence principles, it's important to also clearly identify whether we agree that this is a form of torture or not, and what the international community says, what international law says. Is this a form of torture and therefore cannot be justified if we used Bellaby's just intelligence principles? So, however, the other instructor has also had personal communication with Dr. Bellaby. About this particular scenario, and his stance on this, and I tend to agree with it, is that because there's no physical harm, and I would say there's probably exceptions as always, but generally from our studies there is no physical harm relative to the harm being done or about to be done to individuals, that the use of truth serum would actually be something acceptable. But it would be very at the very top of the ladder of escalation of things that can be acceptable as long as the just intelligence principles are met. And it would be just below torture. So that being said, that's Dr. Bellaby's perspective, but a lot of you argued and had a really strong argument that based on the idea that the Fifth Amendment is being violated by forcing a person to give up information about themselves, which they are protected under the Fifth Amendment, that this would not be ethical. So a lot of you use that, or maybe not a lot, but if more than a few of you use that to justify why this would not be an ethical step and why we would have to seek a different route. This one's tough, and one I will share with you a really good post by a former student that talks about why to him the Fifth Amendment needs to apply to even people who are not U.S. citizens. And so for me personally, I kind of looked at it as, well, the individual's coming into the country, so they're not a U.S. citizen because they're sneaking into the country, and therefore the Fifth Amendment doesn't apply. And if you apply one constitutional right to a non-citizen, what other rights should or can be granted? Should they have the right to bear arms? So some of you will see it that way. Others will say, well, we have to make sure that anyone coming to our country still receives Fifth Amendment rights and also the right to due process. And that's a big one for this as well, because if we don't use due process, one, we could lose the case at some point if or when we go to prosecute, and the individual could be let free in order to conduct more terrorist activities, which to me is a significant consideration. Also, too, it harms us when we don't use due process, but at the same time, there's an intimate issue here, and if we're going to look at the Fifth Amendment rights, whether we can use them to prosecute or not to prosecute, I would argue that it is at least a better option, or at least a balance, if we use it to find the information we need to stop an attack, but not to prosecute. And in this instance, we have enough information, as far as I know, based on what we were given, to prosecute Aziz anyway. Without the use of truth serum, we have enough information to prosecute him as well. So, all right, that's my thoughts on that one. Moving on to ethical theories. Again, I talked to you through the just intelligence principles. A lot of you focus on moral rights and virtue ethics. That was a good one to focus on this week because our conversation was on rights versus security. And I'll talk a little bit more about that after. But one student I've had in the past actually equated this idea of using truth serum to mental rape, and that's something to consider because we're essentially pulling information from them that they don't intend to give. And by doing that, it's a massive violation of mental integrity, autonomy, and self-worth, and so on. So that's just another perspective to consider. And again, most of you argue that it really doesn't matter because the individual has deemed himself an unequal. So if we look at it, Aristotle's approach and his look at justice, and if an individual does something that causes harm to others, they are no longer considered an equal, and therefore can be treated unequally. So we can look at it from that perspective. From Kantian perspective, it's very difficult to say that it's okay to cause this level of harm to Aziz because, we're not treating him as an end in himself. However, we can look at the universal rule or the universal law of protecting our own citizens and our duty to protect our own citizens. If we look at it from that perspective, we might be able to defend it from a Kantian approach there. So, finally, most of you argued that this is an approach, or this is justified, did so using the utilitarian approach, and that is to do the least amount of harm to create the most amount of happiness for the most amount of people. And that's our job as people within the intelligence community, is to protect our citizens. And so this one individual is not weighed as heavily as are the rights of all our citizens. And this also goes towards the common good approach, where we are trying to seek the common good of our nation. And one individual acting outside of that, they're not considered as important in this situation because they're acting against the common good. Okay, so those are some of the ways you can defend your position for this particular theory or this particular scenario and any other scenario. So as we move forward, please try to pull from some of those, or even duty to care ethics. That would have been another good one to use in this scenario. How do we look at it from that perspective? So there's many approaches we've talked about. So just be sure to pull from them as much as possible in order to support your position. All right, moving on to the next step, the second half of your journal entry. This week you are asked to talk about and evaluate how the two often competing goals of human rights and seeking security can be used to shape social policy on the needs for ethical guidelines within the intelligence community. Most of you agreed that we do need some sort of ethical guidelines, but a few of you argued completely against it. And I wanted to talk about those different perspectives so we can kind of have an idea of how different people see this. First of all, we talked about the omens and Pythian readings this week, and I kind of got us started on this debate between rights and security. And I want to point out first that it's important, and Dr. Billaby points this out in a long version of the video I posted, I think in last week's announcement. But really, our security is a human right. So for us to have all our human rights, we must also be given security. In order to have security, we must be willing to give up some of our individual rights. Again, the common good in order to have that level of security. So it's always going to be a tension. it's always going to be tension. There's always going to be tension. There's always going to be debate. Always going to shift left to right. And as long as that happens, I believe personally that we're right where we need to be. If that tension, if that rope snaps and one rules, it will be at the sake of the other. Therefore, to me, this tension is a healthy thing. It's a balance, and we have to have continuous conversation and rigorous debate, as the article talked about this week, in order to make sure we're right where we need to be in that balance based on what we're facing at the time. Um, and it will shift based on what we're facing at that time. So, if we just had a massive national crisis occur, another attack like 9/11 or something like that, then the nation is very willing to sacrifice some of its own individual rights in order to maintain security, because that's our prime priority at the moment. A good example of this is the establishment of TSA. Some argue that it's a violation of individual rights. Government employees are in a way violating your privacy to search you before getting on an airplane. And some take that as that they say that takes away our presumption of innocence, literally assuming you're guilty before and searching you before you get on a plane. But TSA, when was it stood up? It was stood up right after 9/11 with the Department of Homeland Security, so no one really blinked and no one really even had a discussion about it. And if we have the discussion and that's what we agree upon, then we can live with that. But through time, through convenience, as we get away from that event, we start to demand more rights, and that often means we're not quite as concerned about our security. But as members of the intelligence community, our number one goal is that security. So how do we maintain this balance between protecting our citizens, but also answering to them so that they can trust that what we're doing is for their best interest? And we'll never be able to make everyone happy, that's for sure. But what we can do is at least be as transparent as possible when we can be, so that they understand that everything we're doing is for their benefit. So a couple of suggestions from fellow students in order to support this idea in this relationship. I want to talk about how we do this internally, how we find this balance internally, and how we find it externally with the public. So first I'm going to talk about the external perspective and how we interact with the public as a member of the intelligence community. First of all, I think it's important that, like the Stansfield-Turner test talks about, that whatever we do, we can justify and we can defend it if the public finds out about it. And as some of you talked about, in this day and age, the public is going to find out. There's just no secrets today. We can try to have secrets, but at some point the public is usually going to find out about it. It might not be within the next 5 years, might not be even the next 6 or 7, but 10 years down the road, someone is always going to find out about it. So how do we defend ourselves? And the best way we do that is to set standards that we expect from all our employees that are not crossed. And when they are crossed, we explain at least to the public that we felt it was necessary and why we felt it was necessary. Denying it doesn't help us, but being honest does. Secrecy is necessary to the intelligence community. We need to keep secrecy. That is very, very important. But there are things that we can be open about, and those things we can focus on with the community. And one of you suggested was having town hall meetings as a way of doing that, opening a dialogue with the community to be able to say, ask and answer their questions, ask their questions and answer them. And, and obviously you need trained people to answer those questions, because certain things just can't be answered. Certain things have to remain secret, but what we can answer, we should answer. Another thing that it talks about in the article we read this week is the exchange of information between scholars and practitioners. And that's essentially what we do in this classroom, which is why, to me, it's very valuable, because a lot of you are already practitioners and you're doing this in your field, and therefore you have experience. And when you share that with other students and with other scholars, you help to open the eyes of others to see the perspectives that you see. And ideally, those that have left that field to become scholars in it and are no longer practitioners can also share this perspective with you. So that's my thoughts on externally. Now, how do we address this issue internally within our intelligence community? And some of you are very adamant here about making sure we don't tie our hands in our ability to make decisions and our ability to deal with cases on a case-by-case basis. And so your concern was that if we have any set of moral guidelines or ethical guidelines that will constrain us to the point where our hands are completely tied and we can't make decisions that we need to make that are necessary for the sake of national security. And that is certainly a legitimate concern. And so that's something I feel like we need to kind of talk about. So first of all, what I'm suggesting when we talk about a mutually agreed upon code of ethics is essentially a set of left and right limits for the nation. So the entire intelligence community agrees upon where we are not going to cross certain ethical boundaries. And maybe we will not conduct torture. Maybe that's our very rightmost limit that we will not do, but maybe it's not. Maybe that's something that we're willing to do, but if it is, it must be something that we clearly articulate and it's highly controlled. Because obviously, if we do it ever, which is Bellaby's concern, then we run the risk of normalization. And it becomes something that we slip into easily when we want information. So ideally, it's best not to ever allow ourselves to do it so that we don't fall into that. However, I do understand, and I think a lot of you feel that we need the option to be at least on the table. We don't want to take it out of take that tool out of the toolbox for extreme situations. So I understand that perspective as well, and that's something that it's important to talk to our intelligence professionals about. It's important to all be on the same page about it, and that's why, as some of you argued, really what this boils down to, even more than an agreed upon code of ethics, is at least a need for ethical training for our personnel, so our personnel can have a complete toolkit of ethical theories to apply to different ethical scenarios, so that they understand it and can make the best decision possible. When we train on it and when we talk about these different perspectives, it does two things. One, it helps us make sure helps us make sure we make the best decision possible. Two, it allows us to defend ourselves if it does become public. And so here we have a reason for defending our way of defending ourselves during the Stansfield-Turner test. If we at least say we did it because XYZ, ideally the public can at least stand whether they agree with it, but they can understand the reason behind we chose to do it. So for me, I see this as we need a broad set of ethical guidelines so that our personnel understand where their limits are and how much they can and can't do and be justified in doing it. I think it's important if we don't at least identify those left and right limits that we train on, the different theories and how to apply them, then I think that was about it as far as that goes. And one more thing I want to talk about real quickly is the idea of when we don't operate by an ethical code. We cannot claim that we have the moral high ground. And that is something that the United States has done throughout history. We've always been able to claim the moral high ground. And so in this war on terror in particular, it's important for us to maintain that moral high ground, because all it does when we do not do that is legitimize the claims that we are infidels or that we're liars or whatever they want to say we are. And I think they're always going to have reasons for hating us, but I don't think we want to give them more ammunition because we're lying and we're deceiving our public as well as these individuals. And we're doing things that we say we're not doing, especially when the public knows we're doing them. It's definitely something that we have to consider. And if we want to maintain the moral high ground and we don't want to create more terrorists of our own people, it's really important that we walk the walk and not just talk the talk. So, okay, that was about it. And I wanted to talk to you about that. So thank you again. And if you have any questions at all, don't hesitate to ask them on this. announcement thread or send me an email. And good luck in Module 9.